First word. Lynbrook affirms, our sole contention is one step forward and two steps back. The government has incentives to mass surveillance citizens. Thus, if restrictions were to be put in place on the NSA, surveillance would still occur. Greenwell 19 states that the last place one should look to impose limits on the power of the US government is the US government. Even if the government imposed limits on the NSA powers on mass surveillance, because of little oversight, they would easily get around the reform process. Thus, surveillance would still continue in 7 key ways. First is allied cooperation. Posen 16 finds that barriers to the NSA's domestic surveillance would mean increased reliance on foreign partners to obtain data that it cannot lawfully obtain on its own. This is empirically proven as Brenner 16 finds that the NSA coordinates with the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, each country doing favors for one another to circumvent domestic restrictions with foreign influence. International involvement means less accountability, as Gay 13 finds that the United Kingdom's communication headquarters, known as the GCHQ, has a far more extensive collection program than the NSA, and they also have little to none oversight compared to the NSA, leaving them unchecked and less accountable. Second is national security letters, or NSLs. NSLs are essentially tricks that the government uses to collect information similar to the NSA. Crocker 15 finds that national security letters allow intelligence agencies to collect records however they wish, including telecommunications, financial documents, credit bureaus, travel agencies, and more. In fact, FBI and other agencies can use them to collect information identical to Section 215, the Patriot Act. Empirically, Redmond 14 explicitly states that national security letters are regularly used to circumvent FISA procedures. Since these procedures are extremely secretive, Whitaker 17 finds that nobody can find out about the letter's contents, which makes them extremely common. In fact, Crocker 19 finds that unilateral impositions of non-disclosure orders are implemented 97% of the time. This is detrimental to First Amendment rights, as the ACLU in 2007 finds that the gag provision violates the Constitution by giving the government the ability to suppress speech. Third is CIA fill-in. Richardson 15 finds that the CIA conducts parallel intelligence efforts with the NSA, including surveillance and cable tapping. Hartman 13 confirms that the CIA is building a large database of financial information similar to the NSA's phone and data collection efforts. Even worse, Cushing 15 finds that the CIA can engage in domestic surveillance even without a warrant, and their activities aren't limited, as Eagle 17 indicates that the CIA is capable of turning devices against users anywhere in the world, even on US citizens. Fourth is informal agreements with the private sector. Private companies are capable of mass surveillance, as McHale's in 2008 finds that informal intelligence agreements with corporations can help the government direct broad intelligence policy without having to submit to oversight. Problematically, private surveillance is less secure, as Schneier 14 indicates that the NSA is much more secure than corporations, as it has more experience and is better funded. Privatization would be catastrophic for the economy as well, as Michaels in 2008 concludes that if partnership existed for domestic intelligence gathering, there could be a chilling effect and distrust of the private industry. Fifth is physical surveillance. Stopping mass surveillance would increase physical surveillance, as Lewis 14 finds that the alternative to mass surveillance is increasing security personnel, which is more intrusive and risks creating a chilling effect on liberties. Empirically, Levinson 12 confirms that law enforcement such as the police and FBI have gone undercover and specifically targeted minority populations such as Middle East business owners and Muslims. Sixth is through FBI fill-in. Schulberg 15 finds that the FBI failed to comply with basic legal requirements that it was ordered to in Section 215, meaning they can essentially do whatever they want. Removing the NSA doesn't matter, as Ackerman 15 finds that the FBI collects the same information and would simply proliferate its efforts as they collect metadata on electronic communications in the past, but simply use alternate authorities to fulfill it. Seventh is local policing. Kelly 13 finds that local and state police are capable of capturing information about thousands of cell phone users at a time, whether they are targets of an investigation or not. This is already happening, as so Tech 15 finds that the DEA, or the Drug Enforcement Administration, conducted 11,000 electronic intercepts in 2014, up from 3,000 just a decade earlier. To keep surveillance as it is, we strongly urge a negative ballot.
We affirm our sole condition is racial surveillance. Mo Brown wrote in her book Dark Matters and the Surveillance of Blackness that surveillance is nothing new to black folks. It is the fact of anti-blackness. From the usage of runaway slaves to categorization of the census, the government has a long history of using surveillance to subjugate black bodies. Brown explicitly details that surveillance was a way of ensuring that blacks would stay in their designated subordinate places in white-controlled public and private spheres. The bodies and lives of black workers were employed as a testing ground for surveillance. This continued in the 1960s through the use of the NSA's domestic surveillance, as Deepak Kumar indicates in 2015 that in 1960 1967, the FBI and CIA submitted names to the NSA of key activists in the civil rights movement. The NSA officers began surveillance of these activists' communications, and the vast expansion of state surveillance in the 1960s was a response to the movement for civil rights. Surveillance has therefore been widened to monitor ordinary participants, particularly in Black communities. As Adriana Dennis continued this year, that if anything today is different from historical Black experience with government surveillance, is that the 21st century technology advances have made the practice far easier and more widespread. So specifically, we isolate two harms to NSA's domestic surveillance. First, surveillance is used to target racial justice organizers, effectively discouraging racial movements. As Given explains, that officers infiltrated Black Lives Matter protests and they continued their undercover operations despite a lack of any evidence of criminal wrongdoing. Fund concludes in 2020 that using these technologies, authorities can disrupt organizers' efforts and disrupt peaceful demonstrations before they begin. Increased surveillance can decrease and discourage political expression online, and these movements are the best way to produce substantive structural change. As Perry concludes that it was a demand through protests that spurred the quick arrest of police officers for George Floyd's murder, it was protests that led to the elimination of police departments, and it was protests that prompted international corporations to invest billions into fighting racism and inequality. And these are three reasons why this is true. First is protests of long-term mobilization effects. As Enos explains in 2019, that those mobilized remain active in politics and influence electoral outcomes at a later date. Those who are motivated to register by the riot voted just as regularly as those registering under normal circumstances. But second is protests increase voter turnout. As was so concluded based on a study on the civil rights movement, that counties proximate to nonviolent protests saw President Democratic vote share increase 1.6% to 2.5%. But third, protests shift voter bases. As Lynbrook concludes, that social movements continue to shape politics. Whites from counties that experience civil rights movement protest activities tend to be more liberal today. It is important to understand how new social movements such as Black Lives Matter have potential to sustain this racial order. The civil rights movement created a durable shift in racial and political attitudes. But second, NSA domestic surveillance is used by local law enforcement agencies to implement predictive policing. As the law enforcement officials have huge access to huge troves of American communications, and that means the information the NSA collects for purposes of so-called national security will be used by police to lock up ordinary Americans for routine crimes. In fact, new predictive policing strategies rely on this data. As Surreal wrote in 2015, that predictive policing doesn't just lead to racial and religious profiling, it relies on it. This system is working perfectly to the detriment of all, as the NSA could not have spied on millions of cell phones if it were not already spying on Black people, Muslims, and migrants. And predictive policing only weaponizes the system and continues the feedback loop for communities of color to be mass incarcerated. As Guri Glia wrote this year, that predictive policing sends police to certain neighborhoods, but not sending police to other neighborhoods. The feedback loop will impact vulnerable communities, including communities of color. Tech cannot predict crime, it can only weaponize a person's proximity to police action. And more frequent encounters with police lead to higher mortality rates for Black people, as Clean 20 found that a Black person in America is roughly 3 times more likely than a white person to be killed by police. The disparity is rooted in more frequent encounters with police, not just racism. But voting affirmative is a part of ending the bystander politics that has plagued the United States, as Ryan concludes in 2018 that by tolerating a harm when it's complicit, individuals can be blamed for their culpable ignorance. American values demand the U.S. consider the impact of racial sovereignty and community integrity. Democracy can be seen as a collective project with all Americans bearing responsibility. For these reasons, we urge an AF ballot.
Cool. Okay, so let's talk about your first subpoint about protesting, right? So
yeah,
if these protests for like Black Lives Matter and like protests for social justice has already happened, what is the NSA doing to stop it?
Right. I think you're mistaking the idea that protests are over and that somehow the racial justice issue has been solved, when the fact that there's going to be more protests inevitably in the future.
Oh no, I'm just sorry. I'm just wondering, like, if protests are they've happened, they're happening, right? But the thing is, like,
Right.
what specifically did the NSA do to curb, like, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement? Or
Right. So the
other
NSA
movements?
obtained data from like these protests that like allowed them to kind of curb turnout and like allow police to like infiltrate the protests before they began and discourage people from turning out, basically. Does that make sense?
So is there any like quantification for that, or is it just like something that happened?
Well, we have
Like,
we
how
have
many
cards
times?
saying that, but like you want like
Oh,
a
okay.
good
So
amount of times.
I guess I can just call for that after cross. You can take the
Yeah.
question.
Okay,
Yeah.
why would the CIA do like domestic surveillance when they're like focused on primarily foreign intelligence?
Yeah, so the reason that they're focused on foreign intelligence right now is because the NSA is in place so that they can actually surveil domestically. However, when the NSA goes away and domestic surveillance isn't legal, then the CIA, who
Can I have a
wants this
follow-up question?
information, wants to, yeah, go ahead.
Right, what's the purpose of the CIA?
The purpose of the CIA, it's like central intelligence.
Right. But the purpose of the
We're saying that
CIA,
the government's the one who does it. So
you know,
it's like,
yeah, I understand that, but the purpose of CIA isn't foreign intelligence, not just like domestic intelligence, right?
wait, no, it's just intelligence, right? Like the CIA is like crime and stuff too. So
I mean, but
yeah.
primarily foreign.
Yeah, like right now it's primarily foreign, but it's not like the scope is limited to foreign. It's not like it's illegal for them to do domestic surveillance. And the evidence that we give you basically says that the CIA is already doing like some domestic surveillance and has the capability to turn anywhere in the United States.
Okay, you have a question?
Okay. Yeah, let's talk about your impact on protesting. Actually, let's talk about predictive policing. So you told me that predictive policing is in the NSA is but your evidence talks about actually let's see.
No. Our argument is that the NSA has like mass surveillance, but it like predominantly hurts Black Americans specifically.
Wait, so how does this like predictive policing get put into place?
They give this evidence to the police, and then does that make sense? Is that like the link?
That makes sense. Yeah. So they give the evidence to police, right?
Basically, yeah. So police have access to these huge troves of evidence, which allows them to like go to these like neighborhoods and like arrest people for crimes they really haven't.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Do you want a question?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Why would countries do our intelligence? Like, how would getting rid of the NSA increase, I guess, trust in this alliance and allow them to fill in for the U.S.?
Or it's not really trust in the alliance. It's the fact that right now, like basically the United States and like Britain and a bunch of other countries do favors to each other. They say, we'll spy on your people, you spy on our people. So that way we don't have to abide by our domestic
but
laws.
Like a favor, like doing huge amounts of mass surveillance on the U.S., like I don't understand how, like that's going to be
like they're already doing it, but yeah, it's that's the favor. Like so then they can circumvent the domestic restrictions.
Got it.
Oh, that's
time.
First, can be a weighing overview down their case.
How much space do I need for the overview?
Quite a bit. I think maybe a new sheet or like underneath our case, probably.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Wait, give me a sec to get some paper.
You don't need it for a new piece of paper, but like it's just like a pretty comprehensive weighing overview. So.
Okay.
Cool. Everyone good? Start with some weighing. We pre-write their entire case because if we win any single part of our case, we win theirs. Because currently the NSA surveillance is failing due to a massive information overload. Whitaker 16. Massive surveillance programs have become so engorged with data that they are no longer effective, leading to terrorist attacks succeeding and leading agency analysis search for needles within haystacks due to ineffective setup of tools. What this means is the NSA's current system of surveillance is completely inefficient and is not working. But insofar as other agencies fill in after the NSA goes away, this leads to other agencies having effective data, and means you can actually act on the data, which is a lot worse on their case. But then some more specific responses. Sorry, more specific way. One, physical surveillance specifically means you're acting upon your implicit biases on witness in your policing, which is empirically worse than data, because data you still need some sort of like actual accountability and like things to like act upon. However, physical surveillance is just implicit biases. But second of all, specifically local police getting the power leads to more targeted predictive policing in every single area because they're getting more data and they can just act in individual communities and not just on large scale things like the NSA. But third of all, the GCHQ or the United Kingdom has a lot more information than the NSA, and they're a lot more effective with it, which means that if they give the data to the United States, that means more predictive policing insofar as the entire agencies as well as domestic systems are going to be using it for predictive policing. But then fourth of all, the NSA still has to be accountable to courts, but there is little accountability for police officers in America. That's an empiric fact that they tell you that in their own case. In fact, Slate 18 finds that congressional oversight means the enforcement of laws, which is solving alleged race-based domestic surveillance. And in fact, like in the status quo, the Congress is tracking the NSA. However, when you switch to other agencies like local systems, the Congress literally cannot have oversight in these systems, which is a lot worse. But then go to their case proper. First, you can turn it because surveillance targets white supremacy groups that are part of global terrorist networks. Intel sharing and arrests are solving right now, and white supremacy groups are part of global terror networks. We need counterterrorism tools to solve. Is that way is their case on scope because literally terrorist groups are targeting minority populations and are trying to kill them. However, their case is talking about like general movements and mass movements, which is like a shaky link in a death at best. But then second of all, you can delink it because companies are currently selling data to the police, and the FBI is doing the exact same thing whether they fight a court order. In fact, Ferguson 18 finds the police has been developing surveillance technology on their own to implement better surveillance, to implement better predictive policing. And insofar as that, should argue that this outweighs on scope as well. But then third, the FBI is far worse. Nego 13, the FBI has the authority to do prejudicial monitoring based on race, religion, and ethnicity. They're just waiting for the NSA to go away so they can actually fill in. The DIG finds that they've been given more latitude and for criminal and terrorist activity. They can also use religion as a factor to determine whether an individual group deserves scrutiny. They can also collect personal information and can monitor domestic individuals without even the implication of like them being a terrorist or not. That leads to more prejudicial monitoring. Insofar as the FBI The FBI actually has tools to go in and monitor and infiltrate. Removing the NSA and its media data collection is a good thing. But go to this point. One, they tell the protests like the Black Lives Matter that have worked like recently, they get no unique offense off of their case. And second, there's literally zero clarity. Like how much does removing the NSA lead to more protests? We look at the BLM was a massively successful movement for the actual reform. And insofar as that true, protests are working right now. But then another first impact of long-term mobilization. One, we get a long-term mobilization. We outweigh on like time frame because predictive policing is going to happen immediately when the NSA goes away, which means like the case doesn't matter. But then on voter turnout, one, and that's because Hollisworth 17 finds that empirically the small difference in voter turnout has had little effect in favoring one side or the other. It means like some people go up, some people go down, doesn't really matter. But then second, it's all causal because Stutter 17 finds there's a variety of other barriers to the minority turnout, like inadequate language proficiency and even voting machines. That means like there's a lot of area like in communities with a lot of minorities, which means that you didn't solve for one part of voter turnout, didn't solve for all of it. On shifting voter bases, first you can turn it because centrists see like these social movements as an upbringing of the radical left, which makes centrists shift towards Republicans. This is empirically proven by the extremely close 2020 election and empirically proven by a lot of centrists where economic and conservative shifting towards Republican bases, which means that this outweighs their argument on like literally strengthening historical precedent. But on the subpoint B, one, right now people still need data for predictive policing. When physical surveillance goes up, people run implicit biases and police in different areas. And second of all, the rejection of the NSA system creates police for other surveillance. We agree that targeting Black individuals in the status quo is bad, but affirming does absolutely nothing because it just creeps the way for worse systems and worse inflation to happen. That's what we negate.
Just going to be frontlining. And then on their case, it'll be a quick overview. It's like weighing slash, like there's like, or actually, okay, I'm gonna.
Is it offensive? Or?
No, it's just like weighing. So actually what I'll do is I'll have answering our case. I guess it might be easier and cleaner if you just flow the weighing on the bottom of our case. And then I'm gonna read a new overview on their case.
You mute in the call, Anthony.
Yeah.
Where should I put the overview in our case?
Just at the top. It's just like an overarching response.
That's good.
Yeah, give me a sec, just pull everything up. Where is this? So I'm just trying to pull up this document of my extensions. Okay. Cool. All right. Starting at the top of this case on this overview they give you. The problem is that none of their evidence specifically outlines mass surveillance. And whether that's true, they literally have not a single link into our case because it doesn't matter if surveillance can be done by the FBI, that's slightly racist, if it's not on the general population, which is actually what's key to fuel predictive policing. But let's get on to their case specifically. First, they say that too much data means it's not working. Remember, this super contradicts. They tell you like later on the FBI relies on NSA data to do things like contract by supremacy, which clearly means the FBI isn't getting too much data in the status quo. But then specifically, we would just say, then they just say that physical surveillance is worse. Remember the fact that they need the data to do these surveillance in the first place. They don't know where to position themselves to target African American and other minorities if they don't have the specific data. But then they just say that local police have more data. No, that's not necessarily true. They lack the capabilities to do have the massive surveillance to actually like place themselves and do predictive policing. But then they just say like we're going to have they say like it's going to be like more data. It's going to get net worse. No, they don't. Like things like the UK don't have enough more data than the US on its own citizens. This argument is silly and doesn't make a lot of sense. But then they just say that enforcement is not checking the status quo and that like remember the affirmative is checking. It's tenderly checking the NSA. We tell you that right now. Sure, they might have checks and balances on them, but clearly they're not doing anything. Given the fact they're literally just using their massive data to hurt African Americans, hurt minorities in the status quo. On the overall responses, though, first they just say that surveillance is key to target white supremacists. There's a couple problems here, though. The first is that there's no found data that NSA surveillance is curbing white supremacists right now because NSA surveillance is made to protect them. As Kumar writes in 2015, that NSA's mass surveillance is centered on the privacy rights of white middle class. National security surveillance can draw entire immunity to its web while reassuring the white middle class that they are not to be troubled. Instead, surveillance disproportionately hurts Muslim Americans with race racism. As Kumar 15 furthers, the individual being placed under surveillance providing no reasonable suspicion upon their suspicion and reasonable activity. This makes a lot more sense. The NSA does things like uphold racist sentiments by protecting the white people by, we're going to monitor the Muslims that we think are dangerous when they aren't actually doing anything. But then they say that the FBI is doing the same thing. The problem is they don't have a single card saying they can do mass surveillance, which means it's not a turn. On movements, we'll concede that like movements are successful in the status quo. On the turn about how centrists are going to shift and like centrists are going to shift and like Republicans are going to shift to the left. Remember that number one, our case is always going to outweigh death from people dying from literally police shootings is going to outweigh like some movements. But then secondly, we just tell you that like sure movements are being successful, but they can actually create political change, vote app to actually cause political change. On policing, they just say it gets worse. A couple problems here though. First is the fact that they don't have a single piece of evidence like giving you the one thing on why it gets worse in the world. That we're the only team giving the evidence that says we have mass surveillance was actually used to do the predictive police to place police in neighborhoods that specifically target African Americans. They don't have any piece of evidence saying that's true. They can't turn our case. let's go on to their case. Start with the framework. Remember the framework. You prioritize the impacts first for 4 reasons. The first is ending bystander politics. Ryan 18th from case explains that the U.S. has been complicit in allowing these harms to persist for decades, which means affirming exclusive to finally just racial justice. But the second is a moral obligation. You have a moral obligation to reject racism in any instance, meaning we just have to win a slight risk that our case is better than theirs for you to vote for the affirmative. But thirdly is on reforms. The NSA is a federal agency, and affirming reforming the NSA allows for us to do more reforms on a local level, which is key to spill over. But fourth is probably Trump's magnitude. Actually, you can skip that one. Let's go on to their case specifically on circumvention. A couple responses. First, on their first response about how allied cooperation is going to get no worse. The problem is, number one, this is literally not unique. They literally tell you themselves that we have cooperation with our allies right now in the status quo, which means there's no specific reason why it's necessarily increased. But also, there's this argument about how the UK has more data and its network literally makes no sense. How does the UK have more data on US citizens than the US government on its own citizens? This argument is silly. On NSLs, a couple responses. First, we would just tell you that the FBI issues tens of thousands of warrants and evidence cells in the status quo. Crevice 16 explains the FBI's intercepted its NSL authorities to encompass the websites we read, the web searches we conduct, people read on the places we go. The FBI has imposed effectively like 143,000 NSLs last year. This is going to continue around the world. Specifically on the CIA, we would say that number one is not unique. Their evidence doesn't say that is like it changes in the status quo, but secondly, we say that CIA can't do mass surveillance on private sector. Remember, number one, in the end world, the NSA can't do like mass surveillance as a whole. Even if the private sector somehow fills in, they still can't do domestic surveillance, which means there's no effective spillover. On physical surveillance, remember that they need the data from the police in the first place to actually, like they need the data from the NSA to actually cause change. On the FBI, remember they also can't do massive surveillance. And on local police, even if the local police are collecting data, it's not in the same massive level as our case, which is why our case is always going to outweigh, because in a world that there's literally not a single impact to their case and any risk of a turn is like based on mass surveillance, which doesn't happen, we're always going to prefer our case over theirs. Vote for the F.
So let's start, like, can I have the first question?
Yeah.
So, like, let's talk about your framing, right? You say that, like, we should stop bystander politics, right?
Mhm.
Because, like, the NSA is doing, like, predictive policing, all that stuff. Like, why is, like, if we, let's say we reject something, right? But, like, something worse happens. Like, why is it still a reason to reject the first thing?
We would tell you that in the world that like being complicit in the current stance is bad, which means that if we run a 100% probability that you're ending the NSA's racist practices, that's intentionally a good thing, even if like there's a slight chance that someone fills in. Because we would say like the chance of them filling in being uniquely worse than the NSA that does the mass surveillance that is currently hurting African Americans, like numerous minorities, is just like
I'd say that like that probability response just like we just say it's happening right now, but it goes up in your world. But like I don't think it's an unprobable argument, but you can have a question. I'll get back to that in a second.
Yeah. So specifically on I guess on allied cooperation, right?
Yeah.
You tell me that like the US has like cooperation with like the UK and like France and like all these other countries or whatever. It's like cool.
Yeah.
So does the UK have mass surveillance on the United States that is somehow better than the US's?
Yeah, so that's a Gate13 evidence. It's actually really explicit. You should call for it. It says that the GCHQ, which is the United Kingdom surveillance program, has far more extensive data than the United States' domestic surveillance programs. Like, think about it logically, right? Like, the United States, like, does surveillance on our allies, and we give them that data to circumvent local regulations. Basically, we still want data on our like own citizens, but there's laws in place to prevent that. But in order to circumvent those laws, we go to our allies and say, hey, look, we'll do a little quid pro quo. You give us our data, we'll give you your data.
But isn't that like the five? Isn't that like the Five Eyes Alliance, which is like to counter like terrorism?
No, it's not. It's talking about just straight up mass surveillance in the United States citizens. That's you can call it the Gate13 evidence. It's very, very explicit.
Okay.
You have a question?
Yeah.
Cool. Let's talk about your like. Wait, sorry, I didn't catch you. But which link are y'all going for on your case?
Predictive policing.
Predictive policing. So you told me that physical surveillance still needs data to rely on, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what happens when there's no data?
Oh no, you tell me. You're probably going to tell me regardless.
Yeah, so the answer is that they rely on implicit biases and their own opinions on which communities are worse or better. So why is that worse than data?
Yeah, so our argument isn't just that, oh, the data tells you to go to more Black neighborhoods. Our argument is that the data tells you should go to these specific areas in these Black neighborhoods because these are the areas that they show up more. These are the areas that are like more risk of crime. It's like not like predictive policing isn't. No, wait, can I finish? Predictive policing isn't just like you put more police in Black neighborhoods. Is that you position them in specific areas so that you can more likely catch them doing crimes and like have more encounters with them. Which means any risk decrease police encounters is a good
almost across. Almost across. So like basically, I mean, the data says in order to catch more Black people, go to these areas because that's where they commit crime. That's what the data says. That's not an implicit biases thing.
What?
That's what the data, like the data says, go to these areas so you can catch more Black people and put them in the jail.
Yeah, the data.
That is not a factor of implicit biases. That's a factor of what the data specifically says.
yeah, the data is like these specific areas have more black people. You should go to these specific areas in these black neighborhoods. That's what
Gotcha.
predictive policing
That's-
is. It's not just like
yeah, that's
go to
cross.
black neighborhoods. Can we go to that? Can we get the UK evidence that you talk about?
Yeah, the gate 13 evidence. I'll send. Is it cool if we send that? Like, actually, I'll just send it right now. I'm just gonna send the evidence, then we can take prep. The specific line we look to is the first highlighted one, but the rest of it's pretty cool too.
Order. I'm going to start on our case and move to theirs. And in between, I'm going to be weighing, but I'll signpost. Is everybody good? Time starts on my first word. Oh, sorry. I'm going to start on their framing that they read on my case. But yeah, and then down the case. Let's start on the framing that they read to you. They give you 3 reasons. We'll concede to the first 2. I would say that the system is bad, the alternative is worse. We should still keep the system. Even if reform makes the status quo worse, you still shouldn't do it, which means that their third thing about reforms really doesn't matter because you shouldn't do reforms if it makes the situation worse. Let's go into our first thing about allied cooperation. This is where you can sign your ballot right here. They just tell you that cooperation is already happening in the status quo. We tell you, sure, that's exactly because there's restrictions on the NSA, which means that circumvention happens. If you increase the amount of restrictions, you just increase the circumvention. That is the Greenwald evidence we see at the top of the case, which is that the NSA always has the government always has an incentive to surveil, and it always has an incentive to get past these reforms, which is why at the end of the day, the Gay 13 evidence is really key. It tells you that the UK has a far more extensive program, and it's much more capable of doing more analysis. You can call for the Gay 13 evidence. It's really explicit. Insofar as actually you can extend the link. What Posen finds is that when barriers increase to foreign surveillance, you just increase foreign surveillance in the domestic world, which is why Brenner finds that in the status quo, we just exchange favors. All in all, that just means that we're just going to still have predictive policing. We're still getting this data. If we still have this data, we link into their case, but on a much higher level because it's more, there's less accountability and it's more extensive. Let's go on to our 5th link about physical surveillance. You can also sign your ballot right here. They just said that you need the data in the first place. However, the analysis Amon makes you in his rebuttal is that you act on implicit biases if you don't have data, which means that if some officer thinks that there's more crime in one black neighborhood, they're going to station themselves there because they still have to go somewhere. Insofar as that's true, we would say this is a lot worse than data biases because at least this is just data, whereas in our world, you're literally acting on implicit biases within cops' mind. But even then, the independent offense is the chilling effect because if you increase the physical surveillance that happens, you also chill the liberties and protesting that happens, which means we get independent offense off of this argument. But then you can also extend the local, you can extend the link. Lewis finds that the alternative is actually increasing the security personnel, which creates a chilling effect because they often target minorities. But then the local policing argument basically takes out their case as well, because we specifically tell you that the technology is capable of getting data off of cell phones without actually having to be part of an investigation in the first place, which means these police can just act on their own data locally, and they can also act on implicit biases, takes out their case one more time. Let's move on to their case. On the top level, they really mishandled the the information overload term. What we tell you is that there's right now information is so overloaded so that in the NSA you can't even do it. Whereas if you shift towards implicit biases, it's going to be a lot worse, which means that you can't even sift through the data in the status quo. There's literally nothing happens. They just say that the FBI happened. Sure, the FBI doesn't rely on NSA data, but we would say that it's still going to make it a lot worse. But then on the GCHQ not having like data, the Gay 13 evidence is so explicit. It like just to put into context, 97 billion data points were collected by the United States in 1 month. The GCHQ can do that in 2 days, right? It's independent and non-unique on their entire case because that means that we're just going to circumvent this and it's just going to increase the amount of surveillance that happens. It's more expensive. It's more accountable. It's basically conceded. With that in mind, I would say that it's pretty clean in neg.
I'm just going to extend case first, and then I'm going to answer the responses on our case. Sorry, that was confusing. Oops, okay. Starting with our contingent, the easiest place to vote is on our second link. Remember we tell you that the NSA surveillance is racist because it was created for the sole purpose of suppressing black bodies. Remember, ending NSA surveillance is good because it stops targeting and policing and predictive policing, which relies on NS data specifically to determine which neighborhoods need more police presence. This results in more police surveilling black communities and contributing to mass incarceration and increase the mortality rate of black people, as they're 3 times more likely to be killed by police. Remember that their case literally has no impact off off of any of their scenarios. But let's go into the framing. They agreed to the first two framing scenarios. The only framing that matters is this third thing. They just say that their world is uniquely worse. But the reason why their world isn't going to be uniquely worse is because the data that's reliant is specific to the NSA. This means that even if they win, the other people fill in. It's the NSA algorithms that are still leading to this, to these racist police forums. Because remember, the NSA's sole purpose was created to survey Black bodies and to oppress them. This is why it really matters with our uniqueness. This is why NSA data specifically being ended is going to set a moral obligation. Remember when, specifically on the framework, that when you first did bystander politics or Ryan 18 evidence tells you the case is you are complicit in allowing these harms to persist for decades, which means it's imperative to actually create some kind of structural change. Because when you start a structural change from the government, it starts to trickle down policy and goes to like other levels of the government, like local police. Let's go into the overview. They extend one thing saying like the NSA is like overwhelmed right now. Remember, they contradict themselves with the term that they don't extend about white supremacy. This clearly means that they're not overloaded if they're still stopping white supremacists right now. But then we say the second they extend this GHQ card about the UK evidence. There's a few problems with the UK evidence. The UK evidence they list is only comparing the NSA's data with the UK's own domestic surveillance. It's not saying that the UK's foreign surveillance is better. But even if you give them the UK's foreign surveillance is better, we say that it doesn't have the same racist algorithms that are inherently in the NSA's data that makes it predictive policing so much worse in our world. That's why you could still flow our predictive policing to our side. It's a clearly the easy place to vote. Let's go into their side of the flow. So let's on this allied cooperation. Remember, this is not unique. It's happening in the status quo. We're already seeing this. Even if it increases, there's no marginal risk of it. You can even cross-play what I said about the UK and the fact that the foreign people algorithms don't have the same racist algorithms as the NSA. But secondly, the UK and the foreign surveillance, there's no card that they give you that tells you go specifically to the police. At the point where they don't even win that this foreign surveillance is going to the police in the first place, they don't actually have a link into our case at all. Then on this Gale evidence, I urge you to call for it. The same implication. It doesn't specifically say that the UK's foreign surveillance is better than US domestic surveillance. Let's go on to this physical surveillance argument. We would tell you that the NSA algorithms are what's hurting implicit biases. The racist algorithms are telling police where to go is what's going to shape their implicit biases, and that's what's going to stay. That's why foreign physical surveillance isn't as bad, because when you get rid of the racist algorithms, they don't have these implicit biases. But also on this turn about protests, you can't have protests if you don't know where the protests are happening. That's from the NSA's data specifically. But then police acting on their own, even police are acting on their own, it's not mass surveillance. It's only local surveillance. We see the NSA's domestic mass surveillance is what's key to actually having predictive policing. Even if it's a few local law enforcement agencies, it doesn't have the same predictive policing as having data from earlier in the country. Please be urged in the F ballot.
Ross?
Yeah, I'm good for Gran.
I'll come to first.
Oh, okay. I was gonna give you the first question.
You're good. You got it.
Okay, so
let's talk about.
Sorry. Go ahead, Anthony.
Okay, on local police, we tell you the NSA uses its data to specifically widespread data across the entire country and gives them all to local police agencies. Does every single local police agency in the country have the same capabilities as the NSA to collect this data?
Or we tell you that the tech they use can use to collect nearby data. So
right.
No, but is it every single agency? That's my question.
Every single, I mean, you can check the evidence, but it says that there's been an increase, a drastic increase to 13,000. That's what we read in case. But even then, I would say that, hold on. So, yeah, the local policing, they do it. I mean, I don't really know.
Even if they do it, but they don't do it to the same scale that NSA.
In order it's not the same scale, there's still net less predictive policing and less Black people getting.
Actually, I wanted to ask about that. So, how are these algorithms racist? What specifically makes them racist?
They disproportionately affect minorities in Black Americans.
I understand that they affect minorities, but what's
real quick question? Real quick question.
Wait, but I'm trying to answer the first one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so we tell you our Kumar evidence is very specific in telling you that the algorithms, the reason the NSA was made was to survey originally Black bodies. When they came to technology, it's only made it easier to disproportionately affect Black people.
No, I understand.
The warrant for why they're racist. Yeah, I'm going to explain. The warrant for why they're racist is that specifically, if you look at something like a domestic violence case in a Black neighborhood, the police goes there, they report it, that goes to the NSA's data. It's now you have to survey this specific area. For a white neighborhood, they don't report that.
So the algorithms are racist, right? The algorithms that are done to analyze the data.
We say that the system.
We say the algorithms are racist, which inherently causes the police to act racist. Can we have a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Does the UK data get given to law enforcement, local law enforcement agencies?
I mean, they give it to the United States. The United States probably gives it to law enforcement.
Thing, right?
That's not
Wait, why would the United States want data if they don't use it for law enforcement?
No, I understand. I understand that the U.S. federal government has this data, and they might use it for things like counterterrorism or whatever. But why do they give the data to local law enforcement agencies Like
Probably because they want to make like if they have data, why would they not use it? Like, the point of the data is
no
to
point is
help
why
security.
did they? Yeah, but there's no reason why local police departments need the data. Like the ending.
I mean, if there's like terrorism happening, then
Right,
the
but
local police
terrorism
would
will go to
probably
the
be
sure,
pretty
but
FBI.
terrorism
useful.
like the
That
FBI. That's
doesn't
not
go
like local
towards
law
local
enforcement.
police law enforcement. Like
Wait, why would it not go to the local police? Like if there's
Right, but, like-
crime happening, like crime rates, like
No,
okay,
no,
like
that's
no, I
different,
want you to
because-
understand something. The Greenwald evidence basically says that the information that the NSA collects, like the government wants that, right? The
government
NSA
wants
gives
it,
it
but
to
that
the
doesn't say that it's going to
if
be
the
good for
government
law
if okay,
enforcement.
let me make it clear. If the
Okay.
government thinks that the information is useful to local law enforcement, like they do because the NSA gives it to them, because the NSA is part of the government, they're still going to continue this process. I don't like understand
Right,
their
but
true
the whole thing
motives.
about
I'm
your
not part of the
case-
government,
I
but
know, but
that
the-
is the warranting we
The thing
give you
about
because
your case is
that
that
is
you're saying that they still get this like surveillance. Sure, they still can get the same surveillance. You don't win a link that they give this specific surveillance to the local law
no. The
enforcement.
link is the Greenwald evidence, which says that the status quo is just going to continue.
That's time.
Start on the framing they read, and then it's going to go to the overview on their case. Actually, sorry, okay, forget that. Framing their case, our case. I need to make it complicated. The warrant on the framing that they've consistently been dropping throughout the round is that if they compare those words, reform does not matter. The only thing they say is that the data is specific to the NSA, citing an example from the 1961. They'll give you a warrant as to why that's a thing in the status quo. Don't give you a new one. Second, final focus. And second, the impact is that mass surveillance the police can use. This is a double bind, actually. One, either the police gets far more comprehensive and better data they can use for predictive policing, which is also bad, or second, they act on their own implicit biases in every single local community, which means in every single community is far more comprehensive data and far more comprehensive predictive policing, which is a lot worse. Go to the overview. They say we contradicted. We dropped the other response, which is why we still get access to this one. One, the NSA information overload means that the current data is bad in the status quo. The NSA cannot use this data in the status quo, which means the predictive policing is inherently failing this quo. The risk of changing that is when you affirm, because when information overload goes away, there's literally the only way you can get it is like through better data and through really more effective data. That's our argument. That's terminal defense on their case. But then go to our case. The first thing you can sign your ballot is in the local police argument. The only response they extend in summary is that it's not mass, it's local. That is our argument. We're saying that when police systems and local policing get access to act upon their own implicit biases, they do more comprehensive policing on local communities. We cop their impact of 3 times more black mortality because we tell you that every single local police force can do far more comprehensive stuff on every single local system. And the second, the warrant is very clean. Whether it's a foreign or a broad scale thing, that is a broad level thing. When you can act on local systems, you can do it far more comprehensively. And that happens in every single local community, not just the top shelf. But the third place you can sign your ballot is on the Greenwald evidence. The Greenwald evidence finds that the NSA always is trying to circumvent regulations, which is why the team evidence finds that the United Kingdom has had more comprehensive analysis of data upon our own domestic source. I'll call it the evidence is very explicit. It says the United Kingdom can do the surveillance in 2 days, whereas it takes us like an entire month. Insofar as that's true, this round breaks down very simple. Either on the top shelf, the United Kingdom fills in and gives more comprehensive and better data that's like that the predictive policing can use better because the NSA is still going to give them to local policing if they think it's better. Or second, the algorithms still analyze the data in a racist way, which means you copy all their offense. Or third, the local polices get a lot more, they can act on the internal their implicit biases, which is a lot worse because they're often inherently racist as a whole. It's a very clean neg ballot. Thank you.
Cool. Let's start on our case. Our argument is pretty simple. We tell you that NSA data is bad because it's specifically used to predictive police. The warrant is that inherently the NSA was created to do this predictive policing and always inherently be against black people. So when you end domestic NSA surveillance, you inherently end predictive policing. The impact is the Clayton evidence tells you that in Canadian status quo, black people are 3 times more likely to die because of more frequent encounters with police, which means any risk that black people encounter police less in our world means we inherently win this round. Let's go on their responses. First, they just say the NSA data is bad. That's clearly not true because in the status quo, more black people are dying. But then secondly, this argument doesn't make a lot of sense, and it clearly contradicts the UK evidence. If the UK has more data and is giving out to the NSA, clearly the NSA is even more overwhelmed and they can't effectively solve anything. But then specifically, then they say that like the UK data isn't that better. But the problem is that number one, they never have a single piece of evidence saying it's actually given to local law enforcement, which means inherently nothing changes. But then secondly, we tell you that the UK doesn't have the same racist algorithms and the same capabilities to specifically like do things like what crimes are specifically reported in black neighborhoods versus white neighborhoods, which is key to these racist algorithms. On the framework, if we win that, they just don't answer the bystander framework, which tells us that inherently the NSA is doing something bad in the status quo and means any any sort of change in a good thing because you're ending the current racist like things the NSA does. The UK and all these other agencies aren't as bad as the NSA on their case. First, they just say that like the UK foreign data is bad. Remember, I answered on their case. Any world that number one, the foreign data isn't as racist because it doesn't have the same capabilities the NSA does. But then secondly, just the fact that it's not given to local law enforcement, there's really not a single link into our case. But specifically on physical surveillance and like this is how local law enforcement are worse, we said that NSA surveillance inherently makes these implicit biases because if the NSA data is telling you need to go to these black neighborhoods, then they're like, oh, black people must be pretty bad. That's why they have the implicit biases in the first place. But the second is that in the world that they don't even know where to go in the first place, they can't specifically do predictive policing. But on local police departments having more capabilities, there's two big problems here. The first is that the NSA data is literally for every single local law enforcement agency in the world that they don't have a single piece of evidence saying that like every local law enforcement agency has better capabilities than the NSA. That's just inherently not true. Their evidence that says they're increasing capabilities, that's not the same thing. But then second, we said that even if some have increasing capabilities, number one, it's not as thorough, but number two, like as a whole, less black people in like some specific areas will have access to police because local law enforcement agencies won't have the same capabilities, which means it won't be as worse. Like vote off data ending from the NSA over like the marginal increase of a link on our case.
Good on y'all.
Good round.
Good
y'all.
round. Thank you for
Great
for
round,
judging.
everyone. Thank you for judging.
All right, I am ready to disclose if y'all are still around. Perfect, awesome, cool. So I will just quick walk through kind of how I made my decision. But first I wanted to say just phenomenal round. I think this is a round that you should feel very good to have debated. And, you know, I'm especially excited that this round was one of the ones streamed for this tournament, because I think that this is a really exemplary round that I want younger debaters to see, because it demonstrates really nuanced conversations focused in like the real world and like the impacts on real communities. So I think that y'all should leave feeling really, really proud and really happy that this round happened, and that y'all addressed it with like, honestly, a lot of maturity. This is kind of what I want debate to be, and so it was really exciting to watch, and it was a privilege to judge all of you. So the way the ballot kind of plays out, you know, I think on the flow, just quickly coverage wise, all of you are doing an excellent job. I think there is sufficient narrowing of the debate. I think there is some good focusing in like these framing debates that help me conceptualize the round. There's a little bit of mess on both sides, just in terms of like where we're going on the flow. I think like the framework that comes from the AF about like complicitness and uniqueness could have just been combined with like the predictive policing argument to like condense it a little bit, but those are just like minor tweaks. I think you do a good job. There are just a couple places on the flow where I'm like, okay, we're gonna go here and then here and then here and then here. You do an okay job road mapping, but both sides kind of struggle with that, I think, a little bit. And so as much as we can condense, that's just something moving forward to improve on a little bit. But ultimately it's a close round in that I think the debating is really skilled and really nuanced. And I think both teams are making really good arguments. But in terms of the decision, by the time the round concludes, it's pretty simple. Basically, the major issue is the idea that the surveillance that replaces NSA surveillance, whether that is uniquely worse or not. Right, so we're having these conversations about whether like the surveillance we're getting from the UK or from like local law enforcement or through physical surveillance is worse for communities of color. And for me, I just don't think that link is there. The affirmative is telling me very clearly that the NSA's surveillance programs are rooted in anti-Blackness and have a history of this, and so are uniquely worse. And I'm getting suggestions that like local policing is worse. I'm hearing engagement there, but it's just not enough to overcome the fact that the NSA has a mass surveillance program everywhere, all agencies, that contributes to the policing of Black and brown bodies. And I'm not giving quite enough evidence that like a local surveillance would have that same magnitude of harm, because as like your opponents point out, there's not proof that every single local agency has the capabilities to do this sort of surveillance. And I don't think your evidence says that they do. It just says that they're improving it, but not all. And then on the allied cooperation, I think this argument is honestly fabulous. I think it's a really, really good engagement with the resolution. However, the issue is like this link that says that the data that we would get from the UK would be passed to law enforcement, and kind of that it would translate from like being surveilled to enforcement on communities. And I think that if that link had been there, this would be a completely different conversation. But I think that you are missing that really critical tie-in. So even if the UK is able to supplement some of that surveillance, one, your opponents call out that it may not have the same racial biases as the US does. As a side note, I think the UK has its own racial biases that might be just as harmful, if not more harmful. So I think you could have dug into that a little bit, because honestly, the UK is one of the most racist places that I've been to. I have family there, and it's awful. So I think that there are arguments you could make there that are like, there are also racial biases inherent in like surveillance programs coming out of the UK. That argument isn't made though. And there's no direct evidence that it goes to the police. So that kind of plays out there. So then I get this very clear narrative about how like NSA data is uniquely bad. It does get transferred to law enforcement. That does result in predictive policing. That does result in more frequent engagement with the police in communities of color, which results in a 3 times higher mortality rate because of those frequent encounters. Super clear link chain, super clean. I think, the AFI do an exemplary job of like laying it out for me in the final focus. Like, you tell me where I vote, you tell me exactly why. I think that's absolutely phenomenal. So very, very clear ballot. So I obviously vote for the affirmative team from Marist. I think just in terms of like the conversation we're having in the community that we're thinking about, they have the most direct links, the clearest narrative, and I think they do sufficient defense to take out the offense coming off of allied cooperation and local policing. Even though I think the NEG does an excellent job of explaining how the NSA going away doesn't solve surveillance problems, but I think that's a different question from whether it's potentially is worse for communities of color. So that's kind of how my breakdown went. I will publish the results so you can see them right away, and the full ballot. And if you have any questions, you both have my email in the chain, so feel free to email me. Happy to chat more, but really excellent job. Honestly, the best debate I've seen all year, to be perfectly honest with you. So
Thank you.
Yeah.